Hey everybody, welcome to Truth Be Told. Thanks very much for listening in. Really appreciate you being here. Today, we're going to be looking into the character Daniel, and this is one of the coolest guys in the Bible. There's not a lot bad said about him. There's no specific instance where he sins or has some repentant moment. He's just kind of portrayed as a good and righteous man throughout the story, and this is how he was perceived during and after his time. There's a reason that this story is so well known by so many people. It doesn't matter if you're like going through divinity school and you've had several years, or you're working on your doctoral thesis. You could do it on the book of Daniel because there's so much in here. There's prophecy, there's wonderful narrative, there's miracles, there's all kinds of stuff in the story, but also it's one that gets often simplified to be put in children's Bibles because it does have such good storytelling techniques about it, that it's just very easily likable, relatable. There's good and easy lessons to be drawn from it. So this is a classic example of something that can be studied at a very superficial level and a lot can be drawn from it, but also at a very deep level and a lot can be drawn from it. And I just think that's really cool. So often I think when certain stories, get geared towards children more serious Bible thinkers can start being like, like Daniel in the Lion's Den. Like that's kind of, just one of those stories we pass over. We know it generally, but there's actually a lot in here for everybody at all stages of biblical understanding or research or study. But there's another story about Daniel, because I said we're going to be talking about the character, not necessarily the story or the book of Daniel. There's another story about Daniel that you probably have not heard of, and it is called Bel and the Dragon. Now, many people, when they hear this title, they think Bel, okay, well, we know, depending on what level of scholarly study you're into or what history you have in, just being familiarized with the pages of Scripture, we know that Daniel and his friends that got taken from Judah received Babylonian names. And we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That was not their original Hebrew names. But then Daniel, we also have being called Belteshazzar. And this is a Babylonian name that refers to the god Bel, and it means Bel protect his life. And this is really interesting with the understanding that we have this extra-biblical story about Daniel called Bel and the Dragon, but Bel in this story does not refer to Daniel himself. It refers to the Babylonian and also then later Persian god Bel. Now, full disclosure, as I said, this is an extra-biblical story. This is something that's often found in the Apocrypha, so in many Catholic Bibles you can find this story. You can also find it online. We'll go through it in just a second, but I recommend reading through it. It's very short. It's considered like an additional chapter to the book of Daniel. And there's several additional chapters that were found later that some people include with the book of Daniel, but the traditional canon does not. Now, as far as I am concerned, what that means is that this story is not divinely inspired like the rest of Scripture is. However, this does not mean that it doesn't or can't contain any truth. And I think we need to be very honest about this and also very careful with it. But there are a lot of things that are not necessarily divinely inspired that do still reflect reality and contain truth. And the same can be said for this story, Bel and the Dragon. Also, even if this story in like a larger empirical way is not true, like it historically did not happen, this also does not mean that we are unable to learn from it. And I think we need to be honest about this as well. So often I find people that are non-Catholic Christians that don't ascribe to the Apocrypha being fearful of apocryphal works or fearful of extra-biblical texts or fearful of how they should or shouldn't apply reading of ancient literature, especially when it's related or connected to Scripture. And that's kind of why we're going through this today, because I think it's something we should be familiar with, should not be afraid of, but yes, need to treat carefully. And I think that's a very possible thing to do. Doing something like this where we read an extra biblical work and say, how does it influence our understanding of Scripture, or how could it maybe color our understanding of a biblical character? It feels like dangerous ground to a lot of people, but really it is something that we all do all the time. And I'm going to illustrate this in a way that might seem silly to you, but is still very valid. For example, when the Gospels say that Jesus and his disciples climbed an exceedingly high mountain. I read this, and I often in the past have taken my understanding of what a mountain is and applied it to the text. I think of a mountain like Everest or Yosemite National Park, where people have to train and get certain gear, and it's difficult and strenuous. And this is not an accurate reading of what's going on here. I went to Israel a few years ago. We saw the mountains in the area, and they're not just like rolling hills, but they are not necessarily what I thought of as mountains. And so my understanding had to change. This is a small way in which we bring outside understanding to the text, and actually in this case, my assumptions had to be corrected. So it does happen all the time that outside things influence our reading of Scripture, but we do need to be very careful about how that's happening so that biblical truth itself does not get distorted. Anyways, Bel and the Dragon. Let's get into this story because I think it's really cool. And I do think it can help color our understanding of Daniel and teach us things about the character and the understanding of him that many people have had throughout history. This story is not written at the time of Daniel. It's believed to be written roughly in the 2nd century BCE. The events of Daniel's life took place in like the 6th century BCE, so like 400 years before this was written. It appears and survives only in Greek copies of the Old Testament, and it was likely added to the book of Daniel by Hellenistic Jews during the Second Temple period. And this is important because we get a lot of extra biblical texts from this period. There was a lot of writing being done at this period that appears in the Apocrypha, and we often find it slanted in a certain direction. It's either very historical, very nationalistic, or it is very maybe skewed by pagan influences as Greek culture kind of came into Israel and became more predominant. But the culture of the time dictated how things were being written, and so these are the kinds of texts that we get. We also get a lot of apocryphal works from during this time, but it's really interesting that this is the time period we find this in. Essentially, the story of Bel and the Dragon, if I could summarize it really quickly, is Daniel having a showdown with the Persian and Babylonian god Bel. And what happens is there is presumably some type of miracle going on, and King Cyrus comes to Daniel and he says, I don't understand why you won't worship Bel. Look, every day we offer sacrifice to him. We offer a table full of food, and every night he eats it, and the next morning all the food is gone. This is proof that our God exists and is real and is worthy of your worship. So Daniel decides to put a test to this miracle claim, which I think is really interesting. We'll talk about in a little bit. He says, all right, let's do the same thing, but tonight let's seal up the doors and lock it with a wax seal so that when we come in the next day, we can see if truly Bel has eaten this food or if maybe people were doing it instead. And he clearly knows something's going on because before they shut the doors, he and his friends sprinkle ash all over the temple floor. So they seal the doors, and as it turns out, it was the priests of Bel that every night would come in with their families and eat all the food that was sacrificed to him. But the doors are sealed. As it turns out, they have created a little secret passageway into the temple, and so not wanting to disappoint the king, still wanting to uphold that their God is real, they sneak in through this secret passage, eat all the food with their families, and leave. But this ash that Daniel has sprinkled on the ground now shows their footprints. And he shows the king and he says, clearly, your God does not exist. These were just your priests tricking you. So the king kills the priests. He gives the idol of Bel to Daniel, and Daniel burns it with fire. After this, King Cyrus comes to Daniel again. He says, but what about this dragon that we worship? We have this dragon that is in our possession in the land. And what about it? It's a mighty, fearsome creature. And Daniel takes some food mixed with pitch, like some tar, and he feeds it to the creature, and it chokes up the creature, and it dies. And so then finally, Cyrus, after these two instances of bringing these gods to Daniel and saying, what about this? Daniel says, these are nothing. And he essentially defeats their gods, and King Cyrus pays homage to Daniel's God. That's essentially the story. What can we take away from this? This is really weird, really interesting. We don't know if it's true. What can we possibly take away from a story like this? Well, one, I think it's important to note that we are informed further about the type of character that Daniel had. Even if this story is not true, we know that this was written about him after the fact. And so the general prevailing assumption about Daniel was that he was a very bold man, that he stood up for his faith in the midst of a pagan nation, that he was clever and wise and did not just, take things lying down, but really was discerning. This is all stuff we get from the book of Daniel, and it's affirmed in the story of Bel and the dragon. So prevailing opinions about Daniel show that this was his character. So when we read the book of Daniel and assume this about his character, we can have some support to say we're interpreting this correctly. This is how everybody has considered Daniel down through history. That's one thing that we can get from this story. Two, this one's not super important, but I think it's cool. This story just casually mentions dragons. How sweet is that? It's like, yes, there's an idol, but that's fake. Let's put it to the test. Let's destroy it. That's evil. Dragons? Well, we still shouldn't worship them. It's never like it's not real or it's some sort of trick or anything like that. The idol, the message is, this is a trick, this is fake, we should absolutely run from worship of this thing. The dragon, it's like, well, we don't worship it, but I'll kill it instead of prove that it's an illusion or something. So there's this idea that maybe dragons existed. I think a lot of people think that's pretty cool. I don't know if that's true or not, but at least it shows that there's all kinds of stories about dragons all throughout human history in different cultures at different time periods, and it seems like they are this universally accepted thing. So perhaps it's a creature that's now extinct. Perhaps dragons did exist in some capacity. I don't really know what's going on, but it's cool that the idol is fake, the dragon is real, but still shouldn't be worshipped. I think that's a pretty sweet takeaway from this story. A third thing we can take away from this story that I think is really cool is that we are corrected about ancient views of the miraculous. So often people want to discredit biblical miracle claims because they'll say, well, at that time, anything unexplained was a miracle, and the supernatural mindset was more primed to believe in some fantastical things. And so we can't just take those things and say, yeah, those are clearly miracles, because they were ready to accept miracles no matter what. Well, then how do you explain a story that takes for granted the active debunking of miracle claims? The view of Israel and Judah was not anything unexplained must be a miracle. It was, let's test the spirits. And this is a theme that we can see is continued in the New Testament. So I think that's really cool. That's just obviously Daniel's not going to say, okay, that's a miracle, I guess I'll worship that God too. It's like, maybe it's not even miraculous. Maybe it's not even supernatural. Let me be skeptical about this and test what's going on. I think that's really cool and shows us that the prevailing thought was not necessarily just an overabundance of acceptance of miracle claims. And then the fourth thing we can take away is that this story, I believe, highlights the importance of avoiding idolatry. Entire myths are being created because this cosmic battle that they believed was going on between God and lesser spiritual beings was epic to them, and it was real to them. There's a reason the stories center around this thing. Even though it happens in fantastical and maybe mythical ways, it does not mean that the thing being written about is not the landscape with which they viewed how the world was actually operating. And so I think that's really cool. The biblical characters so often get this kind of characterization as if they are these quiet, timid, yogis giving peaceful advice or sage advice on mountaintops. This is not them. These guys were viewed as, and potentially viewed themselves as, spiritual warriors, actively engaged in tearing down the strongholds of idols. And I think that's awesome. It makes the biblical narrative way more epic in my mind. But also there's some things I can take away from it as well. I'm not going to tell you what to do with this information for yourself, but it's something that's been stirring in my own mind recently, and something I think I want to bring to your attention, because I kind of often wonder if in the modern age, we are perhaps a bit too complacent about this. This reality of spiritual warfare has not changed, but our attitude towards it has. And so, I don't know, maybe we should just consider how we might take up that mantle of our biblical forefathers. If this was Daniel standing up for his faith in a bold way against the idols and powers of pagan nations, whether it happened or not, I think we still see this in the book of Daniel, but this is how he was personified. This is how people saw him as a spiritual warrior. The heroes of our faith were believed to be spiritual warriors, and so I think that means perhaps we should be too, and be very bold in our faith as well. And again, I don't know what that leads you to do necessarily in your own personal life, but it's just something I want to bring to mind for you to meditate on. You know, in America, when we hear or read the story of George Washington and the cherry tree, you know, he has an axe or a hatchet and he damages his father's cherry tree. His dad comes to him and he's like, "What happened to this tree?" And George Washington says, "I cannot tell a lie." And he confesses what happened. His dad hugs him and says, "Your honesty is worth more than 1,000 of these same trees." We are hearing that story in our minds as simultaneously, obviously mythological, and yet seemingly true. It gets repeated as if it were kind of a true story. Maybe the details of this story are not historically accurate. Maybe they come from some tiny kernel of truth that kind of blossomed into this mythic story. Maybe they don't at all. But we know and repeat the story because the moral of the story or the themes of the story reflect a reality that we believe is true and worth preserving. In this case, the honesty and integrity of George Washington, and then maybe like the overall like importance of being forthcoming when you make mistakes. Like those are lessons we take from the story, and it gets repeated. We want to understand these things and know these things about the leaders from our history. We can treat the story of Bel and the dragon in the exact same way. Maybe portions of it are reflective of historical truth and accuracy. I can't believe that the biblical account of Daniel is exhaustive, meaning it covered every single day and every single moment of his life. Other things presumably did happen to him. I think also it's interesting that this showdown with Bel could have potentially led to his naming, you know, Belteshazzar having the name Bel in it, like as if he had conquered Bel or something. Or perhaps it was ironic because his name honored Bel, and then he went on to be the one that overthrew Bel in the eyes of the Persians. I don't know, but we're not really given much reason why he got that name, and perhaps this story lends credence to the idea that he had some sort of showdown with this foreign god. I don't know, but we know that Daniel's life included more things than are just contained in the book of Daniel. So it's possible that some of the things in this story did happen. But whether the events of this story empirically happen or not, there are things that we can take away from it that can inform how we remember the character, Daniel, as a man, and how we know his story was interpreted by those who saw him as their cultural and their personal forefather.